So, after an eventful few weeks in the US presidential campaign, we finally had the head-to-head debate between Trump and Harris. Various pundits, commentators and Twitter experts are declaring that it was a clear victory for Harris. A good number of Trump supporters are going on about how they felt the moderators were biased, which is kind of their way of saying that they think she came over best as well, so they're looking for an excuse. Well, I think they're wrong, and that Trump emerges from this unscathed, and the contest is now his to lose. Let's discuss. First of all, let's be clear about one thing. Active political partisans are generally terrible judges about who won and who lost a debate. Unless there's a nuclear-level meltdown, as we saw from Joe Biden, and which even his own side couldn't ignore in that case, partisans of both sides will claim that their candidate won. There may be different levels of conviction in the claim, but the claim will be made with feeling nonetheless. Then there are some people like me, for instance, who are not partisans for either side, but also who are not necessarily representative of the only people who matter. We might have a more objective take on who came up with the best answers, who put forward policies well, who answered the questions, who dodged the questions, which is fine, but only important if those are the factors that will actually matter. And often, one might suggest absurdly, they don't. I made a few notes before the debate to remind myself how I was thinking at that point before the talking points of the event crowded it out. One of those, key one, was the context. So in the last few days, the Harris campaign had stalled. It had started, as we all know, with lots of momentum, a true honeymoon period, where all the Democrats were just so delighted that Biden had stepped down, that they now had a younger candidate who could behave like a conventional politician, that everything was light and joy. Now, it shouldn't be so easy, but the bar had been set very low. There were very few concrete policy positions at that point. There were lots of scripted rallies, but almost no one-on-one interviews. And that didn't matter for the honeymoon period. But the point was, it was always going to matter eventually, because once that honeymoon was over, people would want to know who this person really was, who, might end up being their president. As I've said before, there were good reasons why the Harris campaign might take their time on that. She'd entered the campaign late. She had a lot of work to do, firming up those proposals and preparing key messages. All of that is fine, but the longer you leave it, the more you invite your opponents to define who you are to the electorate, rather than you getting to define who you are yourself. So, my sense for this debate was that, first of all, Trump had the easier job. His flaws are wholly known and understood by the electorate. While in a different era they might have been instantly disqualifying, in this era they clearly aren't. So that gave him tremendous freedom to be himself, knowing that there was not much he could say that would be a killer mistake moment. Harris, however, had a lot more to do as the unknown. She had to project herself as presidential, someone who a non-partisan, remember, could imagine as filling that particular office. I felt she needed to go on the front foot on some of the issues seen as her opponent's strengths and her own potential weaknesses. At their convention, Democrats showed that it was their intent, by seeking to redefine freedom and patriotism to reflect their perspective rather than the Trumpist perspective. Would she be able to carry that through into the debate, and to do so convincingly, I wondered. Both candidates had an interest in avoiding being defensive. Harris needed to avoid the word salad incident she's prone to, like it or not. Trump was less vulnerable because it's just kind of seen how he talks all the time. Most of all, the key context was this. The margin of swing voters in the key states is wafer thin. The partisan vote for both sides is very solidly baked in for this election. They will have to be efficient in getting their vote out, but very, very few minds were open to being changed by this debate, whose votes would actually matter. Realistically, that margin is so tiny that this debate was only going to make a campaign-shaking difference if it turned out to be a total triumph for one side and a total rout for the other. Again, not as defined by the partisans, like some of the people in the comments below, for instance, but by the swing voters. Partisans will always say it was a rout for the other side. It was always unlikely Harris could achieve that. What she could aspire to do, however, was to provide the foundations in this high-profile event she could then build on by subsequently shifting the campaign into high gear. My assessment is she failed to do that. Like the speech at the convention, it was too oriented around what her own base wanted to hear and experience, not enough about the thin slither of that middle ground. She did try to talk to that middle ground at certain points, but then she sabotaged those efforts with many of the other things that she said. If this had been a normal debate between two conventional politicians, one of whom was Kamala Harris, I would have rated her performance poorly. There were numerous straight questions she ducked. There were a number of things she said that don't appear to be true. It's only because the other guy failed to answer even more straight questions and said even more untrue things that she got to seem better to the pundits and all the others in contrast. Okay, it's a contest between two people, not against an objective standard, so fine. But one sense I have from this debate is that what I said after the convention remains true. Democrats traded a stronger candidate for a quicker, more painless transition. They enjoyed the honeymoon period that the painless transition gave them, but now they're stuck with the mediocre candidate, who may be good enough, but the people who get to judge that are those tiny numbers in the thin wedge of floating voters. So, with all of that context, let's get to the debate. I had seen some glimpses of Twitter responses just before I sat down to watch it. They gave the impression that it was widely being seen as a disaster for Trump, so I was interested to see what had transpired to create such an immediate impression. By the way, I think the moderators did an okay job in this debate. I don't think they were biased particularly. I thought the questions were well selected for each candidate. They were relatively tough questions. They could have been a bit tougher when candidates completely failed to answer the question, but I would say neither candidate was disadvantaged by how the debate was run. The impression that they could make on the audience was very much in their own hands. So, the debate. First impressions are important. The first question was a straight question about the economy and the cost of living, exactly the question that Harris needed to get onto, that those who have doubts because of how they feel about their current living situation would be the most focused on.
Vice President Harris, you and President Trump were elected 4 years ago.
Obviously, he meant President Biden, but never mind, I guess he was just having what you could describe as a senior moment of his own.
And your opponent on the stage here tonight often asks his supporters, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? When it comes to the economy, do you believe Americans are better off than they were 4 years ago?
It is an appropriate, pretty tough framing for a first question to Harris. She knows that while some of the economic figures have been going the right way in recent months, many people across America still tell pollsters they don't feel it. She also has an objective here not to be tarred as the incumbent, the continuity candidate. She wants to be the change candidate. So this is a hard one to answer without disavowing her part in the current administration. In answering that question, a Bill Clinton or an Obama would probably start with a degree of empathy to the challenges that people are facing, while highlighting the things that are improving and noting that if only that progress can be maintained, people will begin to see the benefits in their own lives, or some such transition argument. Instead, she said this.
So I was raised as a middle-class kid. And I am actually the only person on this stage who has a plan that is about lifting up the middle class and working people of America.
I was rolling my eyes by this point. I don't think I was the only one. You could not more clearly state in your very first sentence that this is a question you are about to dodge. The answer she went on to make was based on anecdotes, on vaguely referenced policy, and then pivoting to an attack on Trump for his planned tax cuts for billionaires. All of those would have been fine if she had answered the direct question first and done so competently. She didn't. Very first impression. Now, I'm aware then of the uneven task she faced because Trump's own answer was a slightly unhinged rant, to be fair. Terrible economy, inflation probably the worst in our nation's history, disaster for people, millions of people pouring into the country from insane asylums and prisons, taking jobs. These are the people that she and Biden let into the country. I created one of the greatest economies ever, and so on. Half of it on a different topic altogether. In any case, all of it coming over as slightly deranged on any objective measure. It came across as classic Trump, bombastic rhetoric to the ears of those who had often heard it. But it was at least to the question, the bits that were on topic. Because in this case, the question had been an invitation to go on the attack against the current status quo, exactly what he wanted to do and what she wanted to avoid. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole debate in that level of detail, question by question. We went on to tariffs, where Trump argued that the swinging tariffs that he's proposed would not raise prices, which is a dubious assertion. Harris attacked Trump for his approach to China. We went on to abortion, a Harris front foot item. Trump's best line was that all he'd done was to put the decisions back to the states, and he was with a majority of people who believed in exceptions in terms of rape and incest and for the health of the mother. But he had to then go to the Republican extremist space, saying that Democrats wanted abortion up past the point of birth, executing unwanted babies after they'd been born. You could make a case about late-term abortion without claiming to believe something that in any case would not be legal in any state in the country. Harris was clearly vulnerable on the late-term abortion issue, because when she was challenged to say whether she supported abortion in the 7th month of pregnancy, she avoided answering, but she was let off the hook by the extremist talking point. Again, from Harris's point of view, if this is one of your strong issues, you should be able to answer the attacks of your opponents with strength. She was rescued by Trump patently refusing to answer whether he would veto a bill to put Roe v. Wade into federal law if it were presented to him as a president. He too, it seems, is a cowardly politician, unwilling to say anything that will alienate some of that sliver of swing voters, so preferred to say nothing. They then got on to immigration, the topic Trump had already talked about in responses to the two previous questions. Here, actually, Harris delivered one of her most effective attack lines, which was that Trump had killed the bipartisan bill that would have done a lot already to improve the situation. She then set him a trap, which many hailed after the event as truly effective because he did jump straight into it. Honestly, I disagree. Having attacked him for killing the bill so he could run on the issue rather than solve the problem, she made a passing reference to his audience at his rallies. He was then asked a very good question: why did he kill the bill? And because she'd mentioned his rallies, it said he couldn't resist but go there, with an irrelevant rant about whose rallies were the best attended, and one thing led to another, and suddenly he was talking about migrants eating dogs in Springfield. Now, Democrats loved that. All caps, "They're eating the dogs," was trending on Twitter as they chalked up another Trump moment of madness. The New York Times daily podcast highlighted it as a Harris masterstroke, getting under his skin, sending him off on a mad rant. Well, I think that misses not one, but 2 points. One, he was let off the hook on the substantial question about killing a bipartisan border security bill, the issue he kept coming back to over and over again. Now, that was a failure on the part of the moderators, I think, but Harris set up the failure by throwing in that diversion when she should have put the focus most fully on her effective attack line. It is, after all, his big offensive topic. The fact that he prevented action on it, it's your best line of attack you've got, at least in the serious world, where substance is more important than just laughing at your opponent. Secondly, Trump may have done his usual random weirdo thing by focusing on whether or not people are consuming household pets, but the basic principle of how his life for people in that town that is heavily affected by out-of-control immigration, the comedy element meant that Harris came over as simply mocking the point, rather than talking with seriousness to the impacts that people are actually feeling there. She could have drawn a contrast between them in a way that says, Trump seems to care about people supposedly eating cats. I care, however, on all the ways in which the people in that location are feeling vulnerable, which is exactly why we need an approach that solves the problem, like the bipartisan bill. In other words, she could and probably should have used it to reinforce her attack, not to distract from it. What else? We had stuff about Trump's indictments, of course, Harris's changes on policies, during which she claimed never to have held certain positions, for instance on fracking, where there's recorded evidence she did actually hold some of those, coming soon to an attack advert near to you, I expect. You could validly ask why Trump got several fact checks from the moderators against his claims, whereas she didn't. That one was one where you should probably have done that. Trump was asked if there was anything about what happened on January the 6th that he did on January the 6th that he regrets. A good question, but he totally didn't answer. Harris repeated numerous Democrat talking points, some of which aren't factual, such as the line that Trump claimed that neo-Nazis at Charlottesville were fine people, something that he specifically did not say. Trump was asked if he now acknowledged he lost the 2020 election. He said no. As regular viewers, at least those who are not watching through a deeply partisan filter, will recall, my main criticism of Trump, my main reason why he is disqualified above all, is his contention that the only way he could ever lose an election is through fraud. Astonishingly arrogant, taking the voters completely for granted, and ceding suspicion and disrespect for the fundamental processes that keep democracy functional. In other words, the single thing that could make all of those Democrat claims about the end of democracy as we know it actually come true. Considering it is pretty guaranteed this election is going to be incredibly close. So that's the thing. Trump declared that he was respected across the world, and in support of that he quoted Viktor Orban, who doesn't exactly bestride the global stage like a colossus. Harris was asked what she would do to resolve the Israel-Hamas war. She came up with platitudes, which, to be fair, I suppose might be the best you could do at this point, since it's not really in America's power. Trump made the confusing claim that Harris hated Israel, but also hated the Arab populations. Most would conventionally assume you should be on one side or the other. Trump was asked, did he want Ukraine to win the war? He refused twice to answer that, instead said that he just wanted the war to be over, as well as indulging the usual fantasies that such bad things could never happen if he was in charge. Harris was asked about Afghanistan. She failed to acknowledge that the pullout had been shambolic and badly executed, which I think the public pretty much knows for itself. Instead, she talked it up and criticised Trump for hosting the Taliban at Camp David, which had to be one of her weakest arguments of the evening. They talked about race and Trump's commentary on whether his opponent was black or not. Trump managed to fumble it. Bizarrely, at this point, Harris said some things that would have been good if her other answers had been different. So she talked about the difference between a candidate who constantly insults people, calls them names, and divides people, versus one who brings a sense of optimism with a plan to help lift people up regardless of their race and so on and so on. Which would be great. But she had spent the rest of the debate insulting Trump, calling him names, and saying how terrible he was. Some of those attacks were perfectly well made, but it's hard to do that for an hour and then say, you know what, he's the divisive one, he's the negative one, and I'm the positive one who seeks to build everyone up. It's a great positioning, but it has to be reflected in how you campaign, not just what you say about yourself. Otherwise, people won't believe it. As I said, in my view, she needed to define herself in this debate or lay the foundations for how she would do it in the coming weeks. Instead, she used the occasion to attack Trump at every turn. It's a legitimate campaign tactic. I just don't think it was the one that was best aligned with her overall objectives. And that, more than anything, is why I believe she did not succeed in this debate, in spite of what the pundits are telling you. What else? Affordable Care Act. Trump was asked if he had a plan. He didn't have a plan. Harris talked about what the Biden administration had done on enabling Medicare to negotiate drug prices. She didn't talk about having a plan for the future. Again, are you the incumbent continuity candidate or the change candidate? Make up your mind. They were then asked about climate change. Harris talked about what the Biden administration had done with the Inflation Reduction Act. Same question. Continuity or change? Apparently the former, but her objective was to seal her status as the latter, so really it was an own goal. Trump managed not to mention climate change at all in his answer, unsurprisingly, and was allowed to get away with it by the moderators. Instead, he talked about China and suggested Biden was correctly getting money from them. And then we were on to the closing statements. Harris talked about unifying America, understanding the dreams of the American people, and maintaining America's standing in the world. Trump said that America was a failing nation in serious decline, being laughed at all over the world, and that, he said, is Harris and Biden's fault. Barry Weiss's Free Press podcast summarised the debate like this. Trump called Kamala a Marxist. Kamala called Trump a liar. Kamala said Trump is for America's wealthiest. Trump said Kamala is for killing babies at term. Trump said Kamala wants to do transgender operations on illegal aliens in prison. Kamala said Trump is simply a disgrace. It then went on to list the various times Harris had gotten under Trump's skin, got him to go off on a mad rant, and, quote, all Kamala needed to do was stand there and keep smiling while he did it. Hence, it concluded that she had won the debate. But I say again, only if you view the exchange outside the very particular context of where we are in this election. Yes, if this had been a discussion to be judged rationally on the content of the answers, I think it would be pretty clear much of Trump's verbiage was bizarre, as usual. But the exam question was for Harris to define herself, which she didn't really do. It was for her to establish why she was the change candidate, not the incumbent. She succeeded in throwing Trump off his strategy to make the opposite case, but then she largely made it herself in a number of her answers. And if you were going to attack the opponent, she should really have continued on the new, more effective attack lines of making him ridiculous. Instead, she went back to the old attack lines about all of the indictments and so on that have failed to gain traction to date. I think as far as independents go in this round, this debate will count as no better than a draw, which is definitely not what Kamala Harris needed. The question for her will be whether anyone on her team understands this, and are they therefore going to ramp up the campaign to the degree that they're going to need to. If they think they're doing just fine and they continue the process of staying away from unscripted interviews, just doing rallies and ads, I think Trump remains the favourite to win. Very narrow favourites because the margins on this election are clearly going to remain within the margin of error for the rest of the time outstanding. This was no breakthrough moment for either side. The vice presidential debate won't make any difference to that either. So prepare to bite your nails all the way through to November.